Will the new Batman for the Falcons pass rush be found just down the road in Athens in Mykel Williams?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcons.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. I thank each and every one of you go strong with me as every day. So that means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everyday or subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we will be talking about a possible Younghoe Koo replacement. We'll be talking about how the latest backup tight end pickup that the Falcons have made over the weekend might impact their draft plans and signal what their draft plans may be. But of course, it is a mock draft Monday, which means we will look back at a mock draft from this past week and, look at a prospect and break down that prospect and whether that prospect makes sense for the Falcons in round one. And the player that we are looking at today is Mykel Williams, the Georgia pass rusher. I looked at 27 mocks over the past week. Williams was in 5 of them. Mike Green was in 5 of them. But Shamar Stewart was the most popular mock draft selection for the Falcons at 15. The Texas A&M pass rusher, he was in 6 of them. Now, the other thing that stood out this week in the mock drafts, before we get into Mykel Williams, is that I saw more mocks projecting the Falcons to take a D tackle at 15, right? There were 5 mocks that had a D tackle. Kenneth Grant was in 2 of them, Derek Harmon out of Oregon, Kenneth Grant from Michigan, Walter Nolan from Ole Miss, and even Mason Graham, the Michigan D tackle, sliding all the way to 15 in one of those mock drafts. So it's interesting how we'll see. We'll keep an eye on where the mock drafts seem to think the Falcons are going. But overwhelmingly, it does feel like they feel like over 60+% of these mock drafts, 70% of these mock drafts feel like the Falcons are getting somebody along their defensive line. But let's talk about Mykel Williams, the Georgia defensive end. And the thing that you like about Mykel Williams is that power profile. Right, he wins mostly with power, the bull rush, the long arm, and we know that translates to the NFL level. We saw that this past year with Jared Verse and the success he had right away in the NFL. And you're hoping, maybe not quite the same, but you're hoping for something similar with Mykel Williams, where he can come in the NFL and just kind of spam that power that we know can be effective against NFL offensive tackles, and that will lead to initial success in the NFL. Now, it's not just power that Mykel Williams uses. Like, he does have some uses of his hands. Like, I've seen him use swipe moves, but it isn't necessarily something that he's really mastered at this point in time, the sort of technical aspects of rushing a quarterback. He's just trying to be a bully out here. And I think that style of rusher, we typically see those guys, and you saw this with Jared Verse last year, who had a bajillion pressures, but only had a few sacks, right? That based off of how many pressures he had, we've talked about this before, Jared Verse, if he was just an average NFL pass rusher, should have had like 12 or more sacks, but he only had like 4.5, right? And so that type of profile, that power rush profile, tends to lead to pressures, but not as much sacks. And so I think that's the concern with Mykel Williams, because of where he's at in terms of how he rushes, how he wins, that even if he does develop, he still may not necessarily be a prolific sack artist. Now, again, if you can be disruptive at a high level, like we saw with Jared Verse this past year, we can forgive not necessarily being a huge sack artist. Brandon Graham, who just retired, spent, 15 years in the NFL, had like 1 double-digit sack season that came like 2-3 years ago, I think in the 2022 season when the Eagles lost the Super Bowl. And that was it. That was it, But he was a very disruptive player and a very impactful player in the NFL. And so there is no, I want to make that clear. Just like, that's not a bad thing to be, right? Especially when you're picking at 15, right? When you're picking in the top 10, you're probably more inclined to want that high sack, artist type of guy. But, 15, we'll settle for a disruptor. Now, the other thing about Mykel Williams in that disruptive capability is he's a plus run defender. And that's something that he has over a lot of these other potential edge rushers that the Falcons could be taking at 15. And so, I don't think that's as important for the Falcons, given we need pass rush, but it is something that could help break a tie for Mykel Williams in the conversation about who to take at 15. Now, the questions with Mykel Williams is the floor and the ceiling, right? He's kind of a low floor player, right? As far as the pass rush goes, but the intrigue around Mykel Williams is, like the floor is a little low at this point in time, but the ceiling is really high. And I think the concern right now is like, is that ceiling talk put a little bit more into question following his pro day that he had at Georgia a couple of weeks ago? Now he'll get another chance to test in front of NFL scouts later in April. April 17th, I believe. He'll be testing and working out alongside his teammate Jalen Walker, who's dealing with an injury, have his private workout that day. And so that may lead to Mykel Williams redoing some drills, some other things that he didn't do at Georgia's pro day this past month. But at that pro day, he did run a 40 and he clocked in the 4.7-ish range. Some people had it low 4.7, some people had it low 4.8s. So we'll say roughly 4.75. We'll go with that. That's where Dane Brugler put it at his fastest time. And he did that at about 268 pounds, which is up, I think, 8 pounds from what his combine weigh-in is. And that type of speed at that weight is not that impressive, right? Now, he did have a very impressive 10-yard split, according to NFL Network, at 158, which is a very good 10-yard split. I think that's over 90th percentile when it comes to the 10-yard split. So it does speak to there is some explosiveness there. But you do wonder a little bit about the overall athleticism because of that 40, because if he's not a high-end athlete, like the bet that you're making on Mykel Williams, is that a good bet, right? You compare him to Trayvon Walker, a player that a lot of people compare him to, given the Georgia player, given that Trayvon Walker was a very similar sort of raw pass rusher coming into the NFL. Trayvon Walker ran a 4.51 at 272 pounds. Now you do the speed score, the weight adjusted 40 time, that translates to a 131.5 speed score, which is the fourth highest of any edge rusher taken in round one since 2010. Williams, if it's 4.75 at 268, that's a speed score of 105.3, which would be about 52nd among edge rushers taken in round one since 2010 out of about 70. So, again, looking at this one metric, which is not the end all be all, but this one metric, Walker was a 95th percentile athlete, while Williams is a 26th percentile athlete. And so, again, it's not the end all be all. It is notable. There are other metrics, and we'll see if we get more metrics for Williams testing that will indicate that, we can kind of forget the 40 or whatever. He tests well in all the other metrics, or in the majority of the other metrics, we might throw out that 40. But it is something based off of the data points that we have right now. It is something to note at this point in time. Now, speed score is not everything. There are plenty of successful NFL pass rushers that did not have great speed scores, that were somewhere in that range below where Michael Walker is. But those guys tended to be bendy, more technical pass rushers. The Bosa brothers, Chandler Jones, Aiden Hutchinson, TJ Watt, Alden Smith, Ryan Kerrigan, if you want to throw George Karlaftis into that list. Those are some of the guys that have had lower speed scores than Mykel Williams and went on to be very successful NFL players. So it's not to say he's doomed to fail because of that one metric, because he didn't run fast. But typically when you are a power rusher like Mykel Williams, you want those explosive metrics to be high. And again, the 10-yard split is very high. But like you compare Mykel Williams to Shamar Stewart at Texas A&M, his weight adjusted for his speed score is 120. That would be like 80th percentile among first round edges. And so you can clearly see, okay, Shamar Stewart has that high end power potentially based off of his explosiveness. And so again, to be fair to Mykel Williams, it's just one metric, and you got to factor in the ankle injury that he's been dealing with. Might mean that his testing may not be as good as it could be, right? Because he sprained his ankle in the season opener this past year against Clemson. And according to Williams at the combine, he said he basically was like 60% for most of the season playing on that ankle sprain throughout the season. And then at his pro day earlier this month in March, he told NFL Network that the ankle is currently like 85%. So he's not even fully healthy at this point in time. And so all the energy that he's putting into rehabbing and resting that ankle and healing it is energy that he can't put into the sort of intensive training that you potentially could do as an athlete to get your best, scores in some of these metrics and whatnot. So hopefully as the month wears on, we'll get better scores, better numbers for Mykel Williams that more resemble that reported 10-yard split. And hopefully he'll have like some high jumps. And so then we'll be like, okay, the long speed is irrelevant. All the sort of explosive metrics, that short area burst and explosion is going to be there with the broad jump, the vertical jump, the 10-yard split and whatnot. So we'll pay more attention to that. But, watching the film, it wasn't the explosiveness that I thought was a concern watching the film. It didn't jump off the screen like it did for a player like Shamar Stewart, but I think he's a better athlete than a 25th percentile athlete is basically what I'm sitting at. Now, I did have some concerns athletically with Williams watching the film, which it was really about the bend. And I'll be curious if he does run some agility drills later this month or later next month in April, because technically it is March as I'm recording this. So, as we sit here today without seeing that full athletic profile and testing, I'm a lot less intrigued about Mykel Williams as a possible Falcons pick as we sit here today. Now, maybe that changes. But like I'm sitting here going like he's already a low floor player given how raw he is as a pass rusher. All right. Now, we know that power rush profile does work. But again, if you're not an explosive athlete, then, is it going to work nearly to the same degree that it works with a Jared Verse or somebody else like that? And then it's like, well, if he doesn't have the high end athleticism, then he doesn't have the high ceiling to compensate. And so that doesn't feel like a great bet to make in round one, particularly at 15. So I look at Williams. We already knew he was kind of a project. And so it's hard to get excited about that type of pick if you're not sitting here looking at him in the same way that you look at a Shamar Stewart or a Trayvon Walker as a really, really high-end athlete that you're like, okay, if this bet pays off in 3+ years, we could get one of the better pass rushers in the NFL. I don't know if we're there yet with Mykel Williams. So I feel like there are other options that may be available at 15 that feel a little bit like more pro-ready and have similar ceilings, if not higher ceilings, based off of their athleticism. Looking at 80 mocks over the past month in March, Williams was still on the board at pick 15 for the Falcons in 54% of those mocks, which is lagging behind Jalen Walker with 41%. His teammate at Georgia, Shamar Stewart, 46%. So it does feel like the mocks seem to think that the least likely of these top end edges, besides Abdul Carter, Penn State, that is likely to be their pick when the Falcons are picking is Jalen Walker, followed by Shamar Stewart, and then Mykel Williams. But a lot of these mocks seem to think that Mike Green, 85% of those mocks, he's still on the board, the Marshall edge rusher. James Pierce Jr., Tennessee, 91%, and Donovan Ezaraku, Boston College, 100% of those mocks. And so I'm just like, do I feel like Mykel Williams is a better bet based off of what we know today than any of those three guys? I don't really feel like that, right? You have the power rushing, you have the run defense over those three guys, but like, do I feel like Mykel Williams has the upside to be that sort of Batman type of pass rusher, that cornerstone player that we're looking for, that we're hoping that this first round pick that we, again, know with 100% certainty is going to be an edge rusher for the Falcons in round one? Is Mykel Williams that cornerstone player? I don't know about that. He profiles a lot more like a complimentary guy. And so if I'm not betting on, swinging on the upside, I do wonder if that's, a worthwhile bet for the Falcons. And so that's where I'm at. We'll save our final judgment to Mykel Williams after we get the updates on his, subsequent pro day, probably April 17th. So about a week before the draft is when we'll have a more firmer picture of both him and Walker moving forward. But right now, I kind of put Mykel Williams on the back burner compared to some of these other edge rushers as a potential first round pick for the Atlanta Falcons. So we'll see on that front. And we'll talk more about the new tight end that the Falcons signed over the weekend and how that impacts their potential draft plans as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So March Madness is here, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to get in on the action like never before, because right now new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 extra bucks to use on everything from buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories to even who's cutting down the nets. And it doesn't look like we're going to get too many Cinderella stories with the Final Four. And again, as I'm recording this, don't know who that last four team is, but so far we got 3 number ones, and it looks like we'll get a 4th number one. So we're going all chalk. And whether you predicted that in your bracket or not, FanDuel is giving you that opportunity. It doesn't matter what your bracket had, because you have every chance to win right now with the brackets as they sit here today. And the beautiful thing is, if you win, you get paid instantly, no waiting around and worrying about, how some upset's going to cost you down the road. So visit FanDuel.com and don't miss your chance at $200 in bonus bets and get in on the college hoops action all tournament long. So this past Friday, the Falcons signed tight end Teagan Quitoriano, formerly of the Houston Texans, spent the better part of the last 3 years with the Houston Texans, even had a catch 2 years ago in that Texans game against the Falcons, 22-yard catch where he got behind Nate Landman on that particular play. Always got to push the anti-Nate Landman agenda here on the Locked On Falcons podcast, even when he's gone. But Quitoriano was primarily used as a blocking tight end in Houston. At times when there were injuries, he was the tight end 2, but for the most part, he was a tight end 3 in Houston, and that's the role that he'll be competing here for in Atlanta. It's a 3-way competition as things sit here right now between Teagan Quitoriano, Felipe Franks, and Nikola Kalinic for that third tight end spot behind Kyle Pitts and Charlie Warner. Quitoriano's blocking experience could potentially give him a leg up in that competition, but special teams is going to matter quite a bit, and that's not something that Quitoriano, he's dabbled as a special teams player, but he doesn't have necessarily the pedigree or the resume. Let's say that pedigree is a hard word to use in conjunction to this player, but with Felipe Franks, who does have that special teams experience, as we mentioned when the Falcons signed him the week before last, that he led the Panthers in special teams tackles last year, right? And when you look at last year's tight end 3, which was Ross Dwelley, who these guys are competing to replace, Dwelley spent 105 snaps on offense and 166 snaps on special teams. So, that potential ratio does seem to favor in terms of, how many, your opportunities. Special teams is going to be a bigger factor maybe in that tight end 3 competition, which potentially gives Felipe Franks a leg up, but we'll see on that front. But, more importantly than this very robust tight end competition that I know everybody's going to be glued to their seats watching this summer between these guys and whoever else the Falcons add, is, does this now mean that tight end is off the table for the Falcons in the draft? And the answer to me is maybe, right? I think it's a possibility, but this signing probably puts it on the back burner. Right, we saw the Falcons carry 6 tight ends on their 90-man roster last year going into training camp. Even Arthur Smith, who we know wanted to keep all the tight ends on the team, brought only 6 tight ends to camp in 2023. And currently the Falcons have 5 with Quitoriano, Franks, Kalinic, Pitts, and Warner. So there's room to add one more tight end in this competition. Could that be a draft pick? Sure. And we can make this a 4-way competition for that tight end 3 spot. That's definitely a possibility. Is it a priority at this point? I don't think it is. And so if the Falcons are going to pull the trigger on a tight end, I feel like that's probably like one of their 7th round picks or something like that, where they have 2 draft picks in round 7 as things sit here today. And I think this draft class is deep enough that the Falcons could probably get a player in at that point in the draft in round 7 or so that in other years might have been like a 4th or 5th round pick. So we'll see on that front. And if that's the case, then I think it's worthwhile for the Falcons to potentially pull the trigger because they're getting some plus value there on a late round tight end. But it does feel like the Falcons' overwhelming focus in free agency on offense has been to fill depth spots, right? And, it goes back to something we talked about during and after the combine, which is this may be an all defensive draft, and it does seem like it's setting up to be that way, right? I look at the 4 primary needs that the Falcons have. That's edge, D tackle, corner, and safety in no particular order. Those are potentially 4 out of your 5 picks right now. And before the Quitoriano and Frank signings, I would have projected tight end to be that 5th pick, but now it's open-ended. Now, I know there's a lot of people that think, that the 5th pick should be obviously a center, given the concerns of Ryan Nuzul as the starter there, and I think that's more than fair. But I don't know if this draft class is as strong enough in center to really justify it. As I discussed on an episode last week, that using that pick on someone isn't guaranteed to pay off for you, especially on the shortened timeline that this coaching staff may have here in Atlanta, right? You kind of need, if you're going to draft a center, you kind of need that guy to perform right away, immediately as a starter, right? And there's a ticking clock on this coaching staff. And while I haven't taken a deep look into the film of the centers, and so this opinion may change in 2 weeks once I've done that, but my initial impression of this center class is that there isn't really a good bet for the Falcons to find somebody that is going to come in and produce as a starter right away, right? The top 2 centers sort of in consensus is Gray Zabel, the North Dakota State, and Jared Wilson, Mykel Williams' teammate at Georgia. Zabel is a center convert, and typically guys that change positions from college to pros do not hit the ground running in the NFL. And Wilson is just a 1-year starter at Georgia, which is not a combination that typically leads to immediate success at the center position. Like if you look at the last 5 rookie centers that were impactful based off of their PFF grades as rookies, above average starters as rookies over the last decade, you find Ryan Kelly, Eric McCoy, Tyler Linderbaum, Creed Humphrey, and Zach Frazier. And what did all 5 of those guys have in common? They were all 3-year starters at the center position in college. you got to go back to Mitch Morse and Cody Whitehair in 2015 and 2016 before you find a successful rookie center that had a different profile, right? Both of those guys were primarily tackles in college, although Morse did, I think, start 1 year as a center at Missouri as like a sophomore or something like that. But, my concern with the Falcons drafting a center is that player is not going to be NFL ready. And so therefore he's not going to unseat Newsome. So that's not going to be the upgrade that you're hoping to get in 2025. And so you're not really going to get as much out of that player in 2025 as you would like to. And then even if you pencil that player in as a starter in 2026, if the Falcons change coaching staffs, there's a high probability that you're changing centers again in 2026. Like of the 7 new coaches, 4 of those teams have already changed their starting centers this offseason. Maybe more will do so via the draft. I forget the number I said on that episode last week, but I believe 5 out of the 8 new coaches last year changed starting centers in their first year. And so I look at it and it's like, are you going to use a premium pick, one of your first 4 round picks on a player that there's a 60% chance that if you change coaches next year, you're going to change centers? Right now, I asked the Locked On Falcons Discord, link in the description below if you want to join the conversation. Over the weekend, what did they think the odds were that the current coaching staff, Raheem Morris and them, survive to be the head coaches in week 1, 2026? Their answers range between 10% and 60%. So, I'm curious, leave a comment, hit me up, let me know what you think those odds are. I probably go in the middle. I go probably like 30-40% that they're still around in 2026. So curious what you guys think on that. But, I feel like those premium picks should be devoted primarily to defense unless there was just like a home run of a center pick in this draft. And I just don't know if there is one. It doesn't appear so at first glance. So, I feel like you got those 4 positions of need: edge rusher, D tackle, corner, and safety. And my best guess for the 5 picks as the Falcons currently stand is that you'll use 4 of them on those positions, and the 5th one will probably be a double dip at corner because you get 1 outside corner, 1 nickel corner. To me, makes the most sense. So we'll see if the Falcons, as I've said before, like I'm using logic to to inform these opinions when it comes to the Falcons draft, and we know that the Falcons aren't the most logical team when it comes to that stuff. So we'll see how that plays out. But that's kind of where I see the Falcons' current draft plans and strategy as we sit here today. We'll see what changes over the next month. And we'll see what's what at the tight end position. But let's wrap up today's episode talking about the brand new kicker the Falcons just brought in and whether or not he's got a real shot to take Younghoe Koo's job. So the Falcons signed a new kicker in Lenny Krieg, German-born player, 22 years old, spent the past 2 years kicking the European League of Football for the Stuttgart Surge, right? And we talked about all, at the end of the season, or really during the season, where, a lot of people were like, the Falcons need to get rid of Koo. And I was, as a Younghoe Koo defender, I was like, no, I just think you need to bring in some competition, have a plan B in the event that Younghoe Koo does not bounce back after a underwhelming 2024 season. And the Falcons did that with this signing with Krieg. Now, looking at his stats, the last 2 years in the ELF, all right, not the Special Forces from the North Pole, but the European League of Football. Not necessarily a statistical profile that screams like, oh, this guy's going to be a stud in the NFL, right? 73% field goal accuracy, 80% on extra points, 4 for 5 on field goals of 40 plus yards, but 1 of 3 from field goals on 50 plus yards. And we know that generally speaking, the area where Koo struggles with is the long kicks more so than the shorter stuff. And so, we'll see what that, but where the reason why Krieg is intriguing to a lot of folks is because he went 14 for 14 at the combine, making kicks between 25 and 55 yards. Also had a good pro day, and that prompted the Falcons to immediately sign him. There was a little bit of a bidding war, so the Falcons did guarantee some money. We don't know quite as much. I saw some people thinking that because the Falcons signed him to a 3-year contract that was meaningful. That's not. 3-year contract is basically the standard that you sign an undrafted free agent, and guaranteeing first-year money is not unheard of for an undrafted free agent that you are competing for their services after the draft. And in this case, the Falcons competing for Krieg's services, after his pro day and whatnot. I feel like back in 21 when they signed Felipe Franks, they guaranteed some of his contract. So don't think of that contract means anything any more than Felipe Franks being guaranteed a job, although I'm sure some of you are like, well, Felipe Franks did stick around for like the better part of 3 years. And it's like, okay, that's fair. But, we know that those rosters weren't great. But, the issue with Krieg is going to be that he's a rookie, first-time NFL kicker. And generally the rule of thumb is that rookie kickers are either really good or really terrible right away. And the majority tend to be really terrible. It takes a couple of years for kickers to really hit their stride, right? Younghoe Koo took about 3 years before he was able to stick in the NFL. And so that's one of the reasons why, like, I'm not particularly optimistic that, Krieg's going to be the exception, but we'll see. Again, you never know. It's kind of a coin flip at this point in time to see if he can make that impact. So, hopefully he got all those kinks out in Germany with that statistical profile that doesn't scream, like this guy's definitely going to be a high-end NFL kicker. And what we saw at the combine and his pro day is more indicative of what he can be moving forward. But it does feel like he's going to be a multi-year project. Now, to me, this move makes a lot of sense for the Falcons. I haven't been a huge fan of a lot of their special teams additions, but this one to me is probably the best one. Just based off of the fact that he's going to be an international player, right? That the Falcons should be able to get in a roster exemption for him, not only to carry him on their 90-man roster and he won't count towards that, but also potentially this year on their practice squad, where instead of basically carrying 16 players on the practice squad like every team can, they get an exemption and could carry Krieg as a 17th guy, right? And that will prevent him from being poached from other teams by other teams, like we saw with Zion Logue last year for the Falcons at the practice squad, or Matt Hennessy, who got poached by the 49ers late in the season off the Falcons practice squad, which would help resolve a lot of their center issues if the Falcons had just, thought ahead about that. But, we're not going to go on that rant today. So there are some rules and some asterisks to how this applies, but at least gives you a potential possibility if you're the Falcons, where if Koo does, win the competition this summer, which I think is likely at this point in time. How likely? I put the number about 70% chance that Koo retains his spot, but I'm sure other people think differently. But it's like you can still stash Krieg as a plan B, right? That in the event that Koo struggles, we know that the leash on Koo is going to be a lot shorter than it was last year. Should he struggle again? And so you could potentially pivot to Krieg, but there are like rules about the international player, and they can only be elevated from the practice squad for a finite number of games. So there, we'll have to cross that bridge when we get to it as we get more information on that. But at least in theory, you can stash Krieg and use this year as like a developmental year. Although, again, I don't know how many kicking snaps can go around in practice on a daily basis. So I don't know how much development he will get on the practice squad, but at least he can be like an emergency option for you Falcons, particularly if he kicks well this summer and kicks well enough that some other team doesn't poach him off of waivers, but well enough to go on the Falcons practice. So we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. But at least in theory, this makes sense as a good plan B for the Falcons if Koo struggles. So, as we talked about, right before the combine, we talked with Alex Katzen about, the potential of Koo's bounce back. And he indicated that there's a pretty good chance that Koo should bounce back and look like the Koo that was one of the top 5 to 7 kickers in the NFL prior to last year. And so we'll see on that front, but at least the Falcons have some, upside at this kicking position. And if they do hit on Lenny Krieg, they may find the next Younghoe Koo that seemingly has that power leg, despite not necessarily having the production from 50 plus. But all indications are that he may provide that bigger leg that the Falcons may covet. So we'll see how that competition goes, guys. That's going to do it for us here. We should be joined tomorrow by Mark Raimondi of ESPN to talk about the Falcons offseason moves so far, their needs, their draft plans, all that and more. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen by checking us out and subscribing for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, for your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast. We're going to get you geared up for those tight ends and centers and pass rushers that may be on the Falcons' radar come draft time. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every